I have donned this uniform of a Nazi concentration camp inmate to remind you and myself of an era that is not over, of human suffering that continues, of gas used in Auschwitz and in the villages of Vietnam, of consciences that still stop at the national boundary, of Lidice and Kamne. And I have donned this concentration camp uniform to remind myself that even though I no longer live in perpetual danger for sins not committed, other people do. That even though in the land of my birth, men, women, and children are no longer killed by the thousands by a foreign invader, elsewhere men, women, and children are killed by the thousands by a foreign invader. And I am wearing this Nazi concentration camp uniform to emphasize that I feel as alienated from the American government that is waging war on Vietnam as I felt alienated from the Nazi government that had kept me in this uniform. I have lived 1,000 lives and I have died 1,000 deaths. I was the doomed of Birkenau. Any place I was became my death row. In one day, August 26, 1944, I lost my parents and sister, my friends and relatives, my teachers and my neighbors, a whole environment into which I had been born and in which I had grown into early adulthood. In the end, I survived. In a desperate attempt to project some sense into all that happened to me, there is one resolution that is stronger than anything else. I shall never be an oppressor. I shall never tolerate an oppressor. I have no preference for an oppressor who is American or of any other nationality. I do not prefer him over the Nazi oppressor. I have lived 1,000 lives and I have died 1,000 deaths. I spent thousands of the days of my life and thousands of the minutes of each of those days in danger of being shot, gassed, burned, or clubbed to death. I got so completely used to the idea of dying that the fear of danger and death is no deterrent to actions dictated by my conscience. Thus I say to those people whose present actions in Vietnam are as reprehensible to me as were the Nazi crimes. You, the American government, can deny me respect and good standing. You can call me an extremist, a fanatic, or a lunatic. You can call me a communist, a subversive, or a foreign tool. You can arrest me or have your Internal Revenue Service claim I cheated on taxes. You can frame me as a rapist or drunken driver. You can have members of some patriotic organization dial my telephone number day and night or set my home on fire. You can threaten the safety of my children and frighten my wife. You can deport me or otherwise annoy and persecute me in limitless ways. But one thing you cannot do. You cannot have me join you in your genocide of the people of Vietnam. I submit that what differentiates those who support our government's adventure in Vietnam from those who oppose it is not so much their respective knowledge of relevant facts as respective motivations and moral standards. For few are the Americans who actually believe that American troops are defending in Vietnam their people's freedom and democracy. Why, they have read enough about the Vietnamese people's reality under Diem and now under the Hitler-admiring Marshal Key to disbelieve any such lofty claims. If nonetheless they claim to support the American war in Vietnam out of a loyalty to freedom and democracy, they so contend not in an honest mistake, but because they think patriotism to oblige them to lie. They think that the pretense of believing in the loftiness of the American cause in Vietnam is their contribution to the national interest, precisely as the soldiers' contribution they believe to consist of shooting the and killing is a big nation of nearly 200 million. Among so many people, there are bound to be smart ones and stupid ones, knowledgeable and ignorant, good and bad. We certainly have our contingent of yokels who truly believe every rationalization of policy that emanates from Washington. But we also have as sophisticated, shrewd, even sly people as they come, many of them. We have the big business operator, the bank executive, the advertising genius, the stock market manipulator, the Philadelphia lawyer, the motivational researcher, and the conniving politico. They were not born yesterday, and wherever their birthplace, they all are from Missouri. These are men who take nothing at face value, and they are no one's pushovers. They don't parrot the script. They write it. They don't succumb to the rationalizations. They make them up. They don't buy the commercial. They produce it. They don't take the cue. They give it. They are expert in reading between the lines and in saying without stating. They study the human psyche not to quench intellectual curiosity, but to learn how to pull the strings in the minds of prospective customers, electors, and followers. What then makes such perceptive people support the unsupportable? What causes them to pursue never convincingly articulated aims in a country 10,000 miles from the American shores? I submit that what unifies these people is something of a national conspiracy. Being a so-called patriotic American these days is predicated on clearly conspiratorial loyalties and duties. The sum total of these loyalties and duties has less to do with nationhood than with esoteric cliquishness. The pseudo-philosophical premise of these loyalties is, my country right or wrong. But even in embracing this credo, there is already an element of fraud present. For those who act on it are often all too aware that what the State Department and American troops serve abroad is rarely the national interest of the country, and more often than not, the commercial interest of one business cabal or another. They know that the notorious definition of Eisenhower's defense secretary and one-time president of General Motors, Charles Wilson, that what is good for General Motors is good for America, is the catechism of the administrators of American power. But even if they themselves do not number among these power administrators, they have been sold on the idea of dripping down welfare, and they therefore support any legitimate or illegitimate foreign interest of any American business enterprise in the hope that some of the loot would eventually drip down to them. One of the duties imposed upon Americans by the conspiracy that is replacing our nationhood is not to tell certain truths and to disseminate certain falsehoods. There is a curious chronological sequence in the administration of these patriotic self-controls. While the subversion of a particular country is in progress, the so-called patriotic American is duty-bound to pretend disbelief that American power has anything to do with it. He is supposed to be outraged at anyone who asserts American complicity. To manifest the strength of his confidence in American innocence, he is also supposed to pretend that in his view, only one out to serve a foreign cause could believe in American culpability. It is at this stage of the conspiracy that an Adlai Stevenson gets up in the United Nations and denies any American involvement in the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Corresponding denials were made in such cases as the subversion of Guatemala, Iran, and the Dominican Republic. Most recently, it involved accusations by Singapore's Prime Minister. Then, a curious reversal takes place. As soon as the subversion is completed, all reluctance to admit the facts disappears, and instead official American cloak and dagger organizations vie for credits. It is then that CIA and other agents compete with each other for public recognition of their share in the ousting of one government or another, the bribing of one set of foreign officials or another, or the landing of mercenaries on the shores of one country or another. Thus, yesterday's lack of patriotism is exonerated and hailed as true Americanism. After a mere few weeks, months, or years, it has become a tale of patriotic exploits, a proud chapter in a retired president's memoirs, the self-praise of high American officials. The man who already yesterday said what today is an official truth continues, however, to be treated as a near traitor. The prophecy is now accepted, but the prophet remains banned, for his timing was wrong. He had refused to lie out of an alleged patriotism. He had given away the gang's password. How much more conspiratorial can a group of people be? To Vietnam. This conspiracy has not yet reached the stage of self-exposure. It is still in the denial phase. It is thus that despite his own knowledge to the contrary, the patriotic American is supposed to pretend believing that the Americans are merely preserving in Vietnam freedom and democracy. Despite the daily news of horrendous American and American condoned atrocities, the patriotic American is supposed to deny anything of the sort. Every knowledgeable man, including former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, concedes that the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam represents an overwhelming majority of the people. But the patriotic American is supposed to pretend believing that what is happening in the tragic country is essentially a foreign attack upon the legitimate government in Saigon. We read in our own newspapers and hear from our own official spokesmen and from American officers in the field that our forces engage in saturation bombings of whole Vietnamese stretches. But at the same time, we are to pretend that only an anti-American person would accuse American forces of harming civilians. We are told of the bombings of river dams, of the razing of jungle hospitals, of the destruction of food depots, yet we are to pretend, at the pain of being called all kinds of names, that American fighting forces cannot but be gentlemanly and humane. We are told of napalm spewed into homes and raid shelters, but the prescribed outrage at anyone who talks of American atrocities would seem to imply that napalm has the miraculous ability of discriminating between the civilian and military occupants of a target area. When the Chinese claim to have shut down over their territory manned and unmanned American planes, we are supposed to disbelieve them. Once before, patriotism was deemed to oblige us to disbelieve a foreign allegation of an American plane overflight. Between May 1st and May 9th of 1960, no American was supposed to believe the Russian version of the Powers U-2 flight. Only those who clung to the truth, even at the pain of having their motives, character, and sanity questioned, dared to admit believing the Russians. Then they turned out to have been the only intelligent, truthful, and clairvoyant Americans, in contrast to the vast majority, which included the president and the whole pyramid of American officials. More recently, on August the 13th, President Johnson directed Secretary of State Dean Rusk to inform the International Committee of the Red Cross that the United States was abiding by the humanitarian principles of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. The New York Times news item of August the 14th, from which I am quoting, continued, quote, Mr. Johnson had asked Mr. Rusk to send a letter stating that the United States was already applying these conventions in South Vietnam, unquote. Among the many public disclosures of how these principles were being applied was that by the President's journalist friend, James Reston, of the New York Times. Wrote Mr. Reston from Saigon in the August 29th issue of his newspaper, quote, "When Uncle Sam moves in, somebody has to move over. The concentrated power of America is staggering, and this may prove to be the most significant paradox of the war. For this power is now hitting not only the Viet Cong, but the civil population of South Vietnam, and the critical question is, which of these two will endure the punishment?" Unquote. Is it through such punishment of the civilian population that the United States claims to abide by the humanitarian principles of the 1949 Geneva Conventions? And is it a lack of patriotism or mere veracity that makes one stop the president and say, "Mr. President of the United States, you are lying"? When the president spoke of humanitarian principles as adhered to by those at his command in South Vietnam, he had in mind an item Jimmy Breslin, the columnist, had cabled from Da Nang, and that appeared in the New York Herald Tribune of September 29th. It read, "Nuangs are Chinese mercenaries from Formosa. A battalion of them are in Vietnam, collecting good salaries for fighting for the Saigon government. One of them works as a guard at the United States Embassy in Saigon. They always want the wire from sea ration cans for the prisoners," one American soldier said. "Don't you know that? They get a Viet Cong and make him hold his hands against his cheeks. Then they take this wire and run it right through their one hand and right through his cheek and into his mouth. Then they pull the wire out through the other cheek and stick it through the other hand. They knot both ends around sticks. You never seen them with prisoners like that? Oh, you ought to see how quiet them gooks sit in a helicopter when we get them wrapped up like that." Unquote. I have read the entire lengthy text of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, and I do not recall any such prescription for the treatment of prisoners of war. Or perhaps the president, in talking of American troops abiding by humanitarian principles, had in mind the by now famous CBS photograph of an American Marine using a cigarette lighter to set fire to a dwelling, a photograph that captured but one out of 500 such crimes in the village of Cam Ne on August the 2nd. When we are confronted with such glaring contradictions, what are we to do? Are we to pretend that the president is not in conflict with facts? Are we to forget some of the things we know? Are we to use only a part of our brains? And if we refuse to be stupid and unintelligent, are we unpatriotic, subversive, the marionettes of Peking or Hanoi? What kind of mental self-mutilation must we perform in order to prove the integrity of our motives and to manifest that we are not sinister characters, but human beings concerned with human beings? What kind of patriotism is it for whose sake people must lie, pretend not to know when they do know, and pretend to know when they do not know? Is such patriotism, or is such a typical means of protecting illicit business? What kind of an interest is it that must be protected by such immoral means? Is such the national interest, or is such a conspiracy that circumvents the national interest? How do people who know themselves to be lying justify their lies and the actions for which they lie? What is their rationale? The answer to this involves what amounts to our era's fateful clash between two philosophies, between an optimistic and a pessimistic view of man. There are those who say that it is inherent in man to be selfish and cruel, and that nothing could change this disposition. Such people dismiss every radical reform of society and every notion of justice as childish dreams. They assure you that yes, of course, certainly and naturally, humanism and socialism, truthfulness and altruism, they all are good, right, and admirable, except that they are contrary to human nature. I remember that this used to be President Eisenhower's standard argument against any form of socialism, specifically including whatever there is of it in Sweden. It was all good and fine, but contrary to human nature. The implication is clear that human nature is and must remain incorrigibly beastly, and that instead of futile attempts to improve it, we should resign ourselves to this incorrigibility and live in perpetuity under a system that is built around it. If one proceeds from such an assumption, then there is no act low enough, unjust enough, or cruel enough to arouse one's conscience. For if we can live by no laws other than those of the jungle, then indeed the sole competition among individuals and nations must be as to who is a faster devouring wolf, lion, or tiger, and who a foxier fox. Then there is no human test of virtue, principles, and beliefs, but only of fangs. Then the nurture of ideals is an impertinence, and in their place one should hold clenched fists. Then it is naive to aspire to the good society. Instead, one should train one's muscles. Then it is childish to cherish the truth, the real challenge being the effectiveness of falsehood. Those who subscribe to the pessimistic view of man look upon their opponents as starry-eyed idealists, as people of so limited an intelligence that they cannot take a hard view of reality. Even if they, the pessimists, are impressed by the finest in artistic and philosophical creations, they view them as mere entertainment, while believing only themselves to comprehend life and the world. So they walk through life, pushing and kicking and shoving others, sure that unless they do this, they will be pushed and kicked and shoved. Of course, much of this beastly view of man is a rationalization, a theory chosen to suit one's own undisciplined pattern of behavior. Essentially, these men claim to live in a jungle just so they can behave like wild animals. On the national level, these people lead their contemporaries onto battlefields and conquests, for they divide nations only into their conquered and their conquerors. No national value exists to them that is not established by force. In their condescension to those who do not share their insight, they use ideals, principles, and social programs as mental nursing bottles for the unsophisticated. This is their baby talk they reserve for the masses that dream but do not understand. One who so approaches national and international affairs can find a secret justification for every crime American troops commit in Vietnam and elsewhere, for every international robbery perpetrated by the American government, and for every lie that is told as an auxiliary of these crimes. This approach to man and life has had its adherents in every generation and in many nations. One of the best organized proponents of this philosophy was the Nazi apparatus. It was from this root philosophy that it derived the self-justification of every conquest and subjection. It was from it that Nazis could presume the innate superiority of the German race if only German muscle would bear it out. It is from here that it derived the cold-bloodedness with which the extermination of whole peoples and the devastation of whole countries were methodically planned. I have seen and experienced just about the worst of what man is capable when he proceeds from the assumption that this is a dog-eat-dog world and that he had better bite than be bitten. Not that I consider myself a totally different human being from the worst among men, but I also do not consider myself totally different from the best among men. In the ghettos and concentration camps, I have found the essential kinship of Adolf Eichmann and Albert Schweitzer, or whatever each of these two is supposed respectively to symbolize. And I know that since there was an Adolf Eichmann, there is an Eichmann in me. And since there was an Albert Schweitzer, there is a Schweitzer in me. This is the great hope of humanity. This is the great promise of revolution. This is the answer to the pessimists who identify the wisdom of living as application of physical force, slyness, and greed. Man can be either Eichmann or Schweitzer, and that is why it is worthwhile to cherish ideals, to want good, to serve justice, and to sacrifice for them. It is not true that this world is and must remain a jungle, and that the human challenge is to be an effective beast. The human challenge is to be human, our minds being capable of evolving equal depths of synastry and spiritual grandiosity, our hearts producing malice, jealousy, and possessiveness, but also beneficence, charity, and altruism.